Do you think William Spaniel is right that Russia is now on the deadline to push harder as they might be able to have a stronger negotiating position? Oh, of course. Oh, that's not even like a question. The Russians have every incentive in the world to push as hard as possible right now, which is going to come with incredible ammunition depletion. It's going to come with incredible man and material losses when it comes to both armor and personnel. But also the Ukrainians, you could say, might be near a breaking point. It's hard to really say. The Russians always believe they've got them near a breaking point, but the Ukrainians do have a lot of problems. The odds are against the front line breaking, especially as we're already very, very close to winter. And the Ukrainians are trying to get set to fix this manpower problem going into 2025. Not fix it, but at least slightly alleviate it. So I doubt that's going to happen, but that's what they want and that's what they're pushing for. And even if they don't get a breakthrough, they can still take more land to put them in a better negotiating position. On the other hand, the Russians also risk punching themselves out going into negotiations, and in an effort to get in a better negotiating position by taking the most land possible, by hurting the Ukrainians as much as possible, they actually punch themselves out. The American negotiators notice this, and instead of taking it as a sign of strength, they take it as a sign of weakness and then leverage it for a better position. Like, hey, look, I know I promised to have this war done in like 10 seconds, but I'll stretch it out for another 2 years.
Edelweiss 103 has donated $5. Thank you for answering.
Thank you for the $5. I'll stretch it out for 2 years. I'll stretch it out for 3 years. We don't care. No Americans are dying. We're giving all this old junk. We don't really care. So yeah, do it. Screw you. And then from that position, after trying to put yourself out for, 3, 4, 5 months, knowing that they cannot afford the extremely high rates that they need to pay in contracts in order to get people into the armed forces. And if they can't pay the high rates, the only other option is wide-scale drafting in Russia. And if they do that, that's going to be crossing a political red line that Putin would rather not cross. And I'm not saying they would never cross it. I'm just saying he probably doesn't want to. And so from there, that could maybe be a slight position of strength that they could, turn the situation into, depending on how bad the Russians actually punch themselves out. But yes, I do think the Russians have an incentive. And I think that's what they're doing. Because right now, the war has never been more violent than it is right now. You could say that there's been periods where it's been as violent. You could say that there's been periods where we've seen as high casualties, but it's as violent as it has ever been. It is as deadly as it has ever been, and the casualty numbers are as high as they have ever been. And I honestly think for the next few months, at least for the next month and a half, it only has a possibility of getting higher, staying the same. Going into late December, early January, then maybe you'll start to see it wind down. But going into the rest of this year, I think, really, if they could, up until Trump is in the White House, so maybe even into January 20th, if they can keep up the pressure, if they have the ability to, then you might start to see them wind down a bit. Plus, wide-scale offensives during the cold of winter is just asking for your soldiers not to listen to you. My God, it gets cold over here. My God, it gets cold over here. So it's probably about the Donetsk Oblast. It's not just about the Donetsk Oblast. It's about the Donetsk Oblast, and it's about Kursk. They want to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk, because if they enter negotiations and the Ukrainians have Kursk, then the Ukrainians can try to leverage Kursk in order to get land back elsewhere. Whereas the current Trump administration, according to everything I'm reading, well, the only thing that seems to be uniform between all of the peace proposals that Trump is looking into, and after this, we can just get straight into the topics because we're kind of beating around the bush. We're answering half of it, but I can't use any of this for the segment because we haven't started the segment. But the only thing that seems to be uniform between all of the Trump peace proposals that I'm seeing and I'm hearing about is that they want to freeze the front line and essentially entrench the Russians in occupied territory. Not leading to any future, they leave open the possibility of a future diplomatic settlement, but that future diplomatic settlement, of course, is dependent upon the cooperation of the Russians. So settling that now seems to be off the table, except for one sticking point that I don't see addressed in any of this. The Russians do not want to freeze the front line with Ukrainians controlling parts of Russia. There's no way. There's no way that they're going to allow a status quo where any part of Russia is occupied by the Ukrainians. It's humiliating. It's unconscionable to the Russian mindset. It's unconscionable to the Russian government. It's too embarrassing. They won't do it. And so for the next 3 months, I think the Russians are going to be concentrating on doing two things. That's going to be pushing into the Donetsk region as hard as they can. They want to take Kornevo. They want to push further up to the city of Pokrovsk, if not enter it themselves. But I don't think that's going to likely happen. I was just on the Pokrovsk-Soldovy axis, and the Ukrainians are building defenses in front of Pokrovsk. And for me, that was that soothed some concerns I had somewhat, but of course they need to dig those as quickly as possible. And so they're trying to hold the front to give them time to dig them. They're also building trenches behind the city. So they're also preparing for the scenario of losing this major coal mining hub. This like one of the last big nodes in the Ukrainian coal industry that's left unoccupied, as well as a logistical node for the defense of Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka, and other eastern Ukrainian cities in the Donbass that is left unoccupied. Places that the Russians very much want to capture. Dylan, is there any reason for optimism? Yeah, there's some reasons for optimism, but it's all like gigantic gambles. And so I'm not in an optimistic mood, because I'm not a guy to be like, well, okay, let's just roll for it. And I know some people in this country legitimately were just of the opinion of, screw it, I'm sick of Biden at this point, let's roll the dice. And I mean, look, this is not a sentiment that is only shared amongst some few among the population. There are some in positions of influence who give it some credibility too. Here's an example reported by Michael Weiss. Zelensky's staff have become increasingly frustrated by what they describe as the Biden administration's self-deterrence, the habit of fearing escalation with Russia to the point of paralysis, and a growing gap between the rhetoric of standing with the Ukraine for as long as it takes and the actions that suggest the opposite. The idea being that the Biden government was very verbally supportive of Ukraine, but then it would not give Ukraine permissions to strike the Russian air bases that were bombing its children's hospitals, that were bombing its civilian infrastructure, or even its military infrastructure. Not allow it to use these missiles that can go 300 kilometers further than what Ukraine has in its own arsenal that packs as much of a punch, to strike the supply depots or to strike the training facilities or barracks of soldiers behind the line that are preparing to move into Kursk or other locations, or to support Kursk offensive operations, or, for example, the providing targeting data for the Ukrainians in the Kursk region so that they can continue to support those offensive operations, and now the defensive operations of them trying to retain the leverage that they've built in the Kursk region by defending Sudza and these other cities that they now occupy before any negotiations can take place. That's not even talking about the delaying of F-16s, the delaying of the tanks. And we never gave them F-16s. We just gave permission for other country to give them F-16s. I know some creators online, like Crystal Ball and others, have gotten a little confused about that, but I just want to make sure that's clear. And so there were some amongst the population, I know 2 Ukrainians personally, that wanted Trump to win because they don't think Trump is necessarily the most supportive of Ukraine. But they know that Biden has not made the decisions fast enough, or, he either A, has not made the decisions, or B, if he does make the decisions, it'll come too little too late, 6 months after it would have had the biggest impact. Whether it has to come with the providing of DCP, of cluster artillery shells, whether it has to be the F-16 decisions, whether it's ATACMS, whether it's providing ATACMS in small quantities instead of the quantities that would be necessary to have a larger strategic impact, whether or not it was, decisions on interceptors and Patriots, or whether it was the MiGs deal early on in the war. So there has been a frustration amongst some, and so a lot of people, well, not a lot, but there's some people who are of the opinion of, screw it, let's roll the dice on Trump. A Molotov cocktail to our current relationship. Let's see what happens. Now, I understand where they come from. I get what they're saying. Let me argue from a position of, sympathy here. Trump is somebody that has been described by Russian state media, and I think this is very accurate, as an unguided missile. You don't really know exactly where he's going to end up once you launch him. On one hand, he could probably, and this is what I'm fearful of, end up in a David Sachs, Elon Musk type thinking, because these are the type of people that are getting in his inner circle. He has Tulsi Gabbard there. He has RFK there. He has Elon Musk there. David Sachs is just like one person removed from Elon Musk. And even if it's not those types, there's also the realist types that are moving in, like Elbridge Colby, who are now trying to give strategic justifications outside of just a fear-mongering World War III panic. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any concern, of course, about nuclear weapons or, the fear of escalation. But when David Sachs talks about it, it's a panic. It's a moral panic. It's not something that's thought about in a rational manner. But then these new realists gives a strategic justification of we need to pivot out of Europe and move over to Asia. It doesn't really, disregarding the credibility of American influence in Europe, disregarding the goal of nuclear nonproliferation. Of course, removing any, which if you're abandoning an ally who just gave up those atomic weapons for you, you are sabotaging that.
Donated $25.
But they'll be giving this justification, the strategic justification for this pivot to Asia, disregarding American credibility in the region, disregarding, atomic, not nuclear, atomic nonproliferation, which, maybe they just don't care as much about as I do. They'll be disregarding the fact that in order to get the Europeans on board with any confrontation with the Chinese over sanctions or over the South China Sea or over Taiwan is going to require us taking their security concerns seriously. So if you want them to take our security concerns seriously, when the Europeans have much less reason to squabble with the Chinese as we do. I'm not saying they have no reason. Of course, all nations benefit from freedom of navigation laws around the South China Sea, but they don't have the same reasons that we do. Many of them enjoy trade with them quite a lot. And after them having to take such hard hits in trading with the Russians, do they really then want to take such hard hits with trading with the Chinese, who make up so much of the world's consumer base? And when you're Germany and you've got a lot of these mid-sized businesses that are in specialized manufacturing, those Chinese consumer bases can make up a decent size of your consumer base. If you're an Italian wine cellar, those Chinese consumers could really make up a lot of business for you when European domestic consumption is just not going to be good enough to make up the gap. And if Donald Trump is talking about 100 to 200% tariffs on European exports, I mean, is that going to make up the difference? If you're going to be passing so much more of the cost down to the consumer, are those consumers going to stay consuming? I mean, Europe is one of our main export markets and they export a lot to us, but we just don't know how that trade conversation is going to go. That's going to be especially disastrous for the Germans, who will probably have tens of billions of extra added costs and possible income taken away from the state budget, which is already under tremendous financial strain, to the point that the German government, under the traffic light coalition, the SPD, the Greens, and the social liberal FDP, has just collapsed over their financial minister. What's his name? But the FDP official, this confrontation with Olaf Scholz over the budget and over $3 billion extra to Ukraine, and whether they're going to be financing the budget recovery through concentrated spending. Or point is, their economy is under pressure. And these are all things that the Europeans are going to consider if we disregard their security interests just to think about our pivot to Asia. And these are just a few things. I could talk about the morality or the ideological angle, not that the realists much care about, say, the defense of a liberal democracy or, standing up for a commitment in this way. The point is, though, these people, the realists or the fearmongers, or the know-it-alls who just found out about Ukraine, like, these people are around Donald Trump. And whether Tulsi Gabbard or RFK or, Greenwich, this ambassador to Germany, or any of these other guys, they end up getting these position appointments, is probably going to end up determining a big starting point where we're going to be starting from in this struggle over Donald Trump's opinion and support for Ukraine. Whether we're going to be starting from a very disadvantaged position in order trying to make the case to Donald Trump that it's beneficial to support Ukraine, or we're going to start from the position of, oh, snap, Tulsi Gabbard, a special envoy to Ukraine, we are bowed. Don't worry, they've got the assistance of repertoire RFK, who's going to be bringing his diplomatic insight to the matter. So if it's Mike Pompeo, we'll get one outcome. If it's the former U.S. ambassador to Germany, I think we'll get another. And I also think, who ends up being Senate leader, whether it's going to be Thune, Cornyn, or Rick Scott, that'll probably have a big impact too. Thune and Cornyn probably would be more supportive of Ukraine, generally speaking. Rick Scott, probably less so. It's part of the reason why you're seeing Jack Posobiec and others, David Sachs too, rail against the idea of Mike Pompeo being the next Secretary of State, even though he is a leading contender. So is the U.S. ambassador to Germany. Worse outcome. Or you have whether it's going to be Thune or Cornyn leading the Senate. So that's like the battle over Trump's advisors that a lot of people see as like the first step to whether Trump could be a better advantage, because if it's Mike Pompeo, Russians give a bad offer, then maybe they entrench and support the Ukrainians more, or they're willing to stick their neck out more in negotiations to get a better deal, or you're going to get somebody like the U.S. ambassador to Germany, or Tulsi Gabbard, or some other person chirping in Trump's ear, that their main priority is just going to be ending the war as quickly as possible, and therefore they're going to make concessions to the Russians, possibly with the Ukrainians not even there, that could lead to disaster. And so there's some people, because of that first possible outcome, and the idea that a lot of Ukrainians have seen the Russians come to the table before, and then the table gets flip, 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 flip. If that happens again, and Trump is faced with that inability to make a deal happen that they can come away with saying this looks like a W, then at the end of the day, Trump might be, his honor might be hurt, or his political standing might be hurt in such a way that he now has to be confronted with the fact that it's actually really hard to negotiate with the Russians, because the Russians' demands in Ukraine are unreasonable, that they're not, they're not that good. But we can't really know until, number one, who these appointments are going to be for these positions, and we can't also know until we see the official Trump plan. We have some idea of what an official Trump plan could look like, but we could read a little bit from the Kiev Independent here, and then we got a report from the Wall Street Journal, so I can give you an idea of what a Trump plan would actually look like. While few details have been forthcoming from Trump himself, numerous reports over the last year have given some clues about his plans to end Russia's war against Ukraine. The very nature of such a quick deal heavily suggests Ukraine being forced to cede land to Russia. In April, the Washington Post reported Trump would pressure Ukraine to cede the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia occupied in 2014, in the far eastern Donbass region it currently holds much of. A source told the paper that he believes both Moscow and Kiev want to save face, they want a way out. Can I just say about this deal? Ukrainians are going to be upset about making them give up any land. While Ukrainians do want to end the war, generally speaking, if you ask them to give up land to do so, they think this will just reward the Russians and lead to more incursions and more land grabs. And they also don't want to abandon people in occupied territory after seeing the brutality of things like Bucha. Then again, here's another angle. Putting that aside, which, depending on how the war goes, will have to be a painful reality, or maybe will be a painful reality that they fight against until it goes. Who knows how it ends? Putting that aside to a second. This thing he says about the Donbass region, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, Slovyansk, Chasiv Yar, there are still many Ukrainian cities that are unoccupied. And when you talk about Kramatorsk, we're talking about cities like 150,000 people. We're not talking about like, oh, here's 3,000 villagers that are only left in the... No, there's hundreds of thousands of people, including people that have lived in Crimea, were then displaced from Crimea. They then moved to Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, were then displaced from the city of Donetsk due to the second Russian invasion. And now the third Russian invasion that they're facing, they're in Kramatorsk, they might be forced to leave their house again. And under this deal, if it was, oh, you give them this, That would mean Ukrainian soldiers going to Ukrainian cities, the people who have been displaced 2 times previously, and telling them to leave their homes, flee west, give up this land to the Russians after 10 years of struggle in the Donbass. Freezing the line comes with its own complications, especially with, again, parts of Kursk being held by the Ukrainians, which to them is leverage, and they want to hold that onto that leverage desperately. It's why the Russians are fighting so hard to push them out, and why the Ukrainians are fighting so hard to stay in Sudza. Asking them to give up land that they fought for and defended and even liberated. Kramatorsk was liberated back in 2014. That is something that could be societally destructive for Ukraine. I'm not going to say it's going to lead to like revolution, the government collapsing. I can't say that. But what I can say is that this is a people who have made their opinions well known on the street before. And I think something like that could be societally destructive and acidic for the American Ukrainian PR relationship, to say the least. The source also claimed Trump believes that Ukrainians in Russian-occupied territories would be okay with being part of Russia. Now, see, this is the thing that gets me. Where is he, if this is true, where is Trump getting this information? It'd be one thing for Trump to be like, hey, in Crimea, due to what we know is this long policy of Russian settlement, the odds of there being more disagreement is lower, definitely after the mass displacement that has taken over 12 years. If he had some, like, if I could find some nuance in this position somewhere, maybe I could find some saving grace and like, well, at least it's not completely brain dead. You know, I would still disagree with it in this way because there's a lot of Crimeans who don't want to express their opinions. But no, this is just, oh, if, you know, occupied cities, they just all like it that way. It ignores the people. If 80% of the people have left and 20% have stayed, but that 20% like it, is that like a good state of affairs? And even if that 20% saying they assume they all like it is bull, because a lot of them don't. That's why there's car bombings in occupied territory. Cars don't start going kaboom unless somebody disagrees with something, okay? I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. But even if we were to assume that was the case, when cities like Chasiv Yar get captured, it'll be with 5% of their pre-war population, assuming the vast majority did not want to go through being occupied, or at least the violence that leads up to occupation. And if you poll those people, the vast majority of them are not supporting occupation. So yes, after you cleanse out 95% of the population and then replace a lot of it with settlers, maybe those people overall would be okay with occupation, but those are no longer the communities that claim to be there. Mariupol is not Mariupol without its people. All cities and communities are nothing without its people. People are your most valuable thing in your cities. So not a fan of this, and not a fan of whoever got this in his head, whether it was Elon or whether it was someone. And by the way, the reason I would think it was Elon, and I say this with no joy, and this is something that concerns me quite a bit, is that Elon Musk joined Trump's first call with Zelensky. Why? But the why? Why? Elon Musk is not an expert in the region. Elon Musk knows very little to nothing about Ukrainian history. When Elon Musk was offering peace proposals, he was saying that, oh, all this land in eastern Ukraine, they don't really want to be part of Ukraine anyway. Why? Well, did you see that all these people here voted for Yanukovych? As if voting for Yanukovych was an endorsement of Russian separatism. Because if you vote for somebody who wants a favorable relationship with the Russians, oh, that must mean you want to be a Russian. It makes, on its face, once you say it out loud, it's silly. It doesn't make any sense. So somebody was talking about autonomous regions having like independent UN votes. He was talking about things that were quite naive given the circumstances for a solution to the war. Him saying that the handing over of Crimea to Ukraine was a mistake? A mistake? The fact that Ukraine ever had Crimea was a mistake? That's your starting position? A businessman with no knowledge of the war is going to be the person you open with Zelensky in these negotiations, in these talks about what the future of this is going to be? That's who you open with? It'd be one thing if you listened to Elon in a meeting once about the war. It's another thing that Elon, the richest man on the planet, is sitting in on phone calls between the president-elect and a leader who's his country is dependent upon our aid after Elon tried to do some like pretty crappy peacemaking online. It's concerning because Elon is not well informed about the war. The people he surrounds himself about the war who could maybe make him more informed are people like David Sachs, who are going to give him negative information, going to put him in a worse spot than he was before. And like in his justifications of like, well, you know, if these villages really supported being part of Ukraine, they would have resisted harder. And, you know, what'll happen is Russia will get to the villages that like Ukraine the most and the resistance will increase. He just doesn't know how the war is. He doesn't understand any of it. You go to these frontline villages that are about to get captured. There's no village left. The village is gone. What do you mean? Like, you think like the 3 babushkas in their basements that are left in these frontline villages, if they support Ukraine, are like going to take out shotguns and like bandoliers full of grenades and go out there and just start like, no, they're going to get taken out by an FPV drone. That would, this is not a man that should be in the room discussing the future of Ukraine. This is a guy who actively undercut Ukraine's offensive operations on Crimea when they were using Starlink to hit at their navy and to hit at this military base. And Elon cut it because he thought it would start World War III. The Ukrainians then went through with the operation through other means anyway, and then World War III did not happen. If Donald Trump wants to project peace through strength, you do not start with this guy who is acting like quite in an appeasing manner towards the Russians on this issue. That's not how you project peace through strength. You also don't project peace through strength by undercutting aid to Ukraine during crucial points in the war, which hurt their military position and negotiating position. But I digress. So let's move away from some of these potential like plans from the Kiev Independent, and let's read the most recent plan that came out of the Wall Street Journal. Now, the Wall Street Journal, is paywalled, so I'm just going to read the portions that I can without completely just giving up the article. You go read the article yourself, pay for the Wall Street Journal. Let me just read you the section on the peace plan very quickly. Anyone, no matter how senior in Trump's circle, who claims to have a different view or more detailed window into his plans on Ukraine simply doesn't know what he or she is talking about, or doesn't understand that he makes his own calls on national security issues, many times in the moment, particularly on an issue as central as this, a former Trump National Security Council aide said. That's not good, by the way. Oh, you know, he'll make his decision in the moment. That's like in Trump's first term, different factions are set to compete to influence in the Republicans' foreign policy. More traditionally minded allies such as Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State in contention to lead the Pentagon, are likely to push for a settlement that doesn't appear to give a major win to Moscow. Other advisors, particularly Richard Grenell, he is the former U.S. ambassador to Germany, a top candidate to lead the State Department or serve as national security advisor, could give priority to Trump's desire to end the war as soon as possible, even if it means forcing Kiev into significant concessions. The proposals all break from Biden's approach of letting Kiev dictate when peace talks should begin. Instead, they uniformly recommend freezing the war in place, cementing Russia's seizure of roughly 20% of Ukraine, and forcing Ukraine to temporarily suspend its quest to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Okay, so this is usually paired in what this article goes on to describe is the idea that it would work is they're going to ask Ukraine to allow Russia to take the land that they have and cement their control there. In exchange for that, or Ukraine will also have to, swear off NATO membership for at least 20 years is one timeline that I've heard. And what Ukraine will get in exchange is they'll be given weapons. They'll be given weapons, and these weapons will allow them to fortify themselves. And then from this fortified new weaponed position with all these new American weapons, the Russians will then have that disincentive from invading them again. That seems to be the proposal. Oh, and of course, a 800 mile demilitarized zone. So they wouldn't have like big armor here or there anywhere near the front line where they could have a major impact. Okay. Now, people are asking what weapons. We don't know. But here's my immediate problems with this. Number one, allowing the Russians to keep the land that they have, especially when Ukraine has leverage in Kursk, I don't think sends the right message, especially if the Ukrainians, which the Russians will make this demand, have to give up Kursk in order for us to freeze the line, because I do not believe under any circumstances the Russians are going to accept the plan where the lines are frozen and the Ukrainians have territory that is internationally recognized as parts of Russia. I mean, hey, it was part of the Ukrainian government in like 1918 or whatever, but you know, a lot of time has come since 1918. The Ukrainians are not particularly interested in having Kursk, and the Russians really want them out of Kursk. So freezing the current lines in exchange of doing some land for land swap, where the Ukrainians could get some territory back, I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm also not a huge fan of cementing their control over the occupied territory to begin with. Not only do I think it rewards the Russian government and sends the message that these types of imperial land grabs are rewarded with territorial conquests and then recognized by other major powers, but it also means cementing a type of Russian occupation and brutality in occupied territory. That's going to mean expanding the economic dilapidation that was occupied Donetsk to the rest of these territories. It means hundreds of thousands to millions of Ukrainians never returning back to their homes because they cannot go back to Mariupol due to ties to the government, due to critiques of Putin, due to ties to people in the armed forces, due to themselves having served in the armed forces. There's not going to be an option for these people to go home because the Russian government simply will not be able to trust these people because they're Ukrainians. And it's as simple as that. If they continue to espouse that they're Ukrainians in occupied territory, that undercuts their new national narrative of this liberation plan. They're going into these occupied villages and cities and towns, and they're changing the Ukrainian names from Ukrainian to Russian. They're teaching the new kids through re-education programs that they're Russian, not Ukrainians, and they're making them sing Russian patriotic anthems, dressing up like Russian soldiers and old Soviet soldiers, and denouncing fascism and the Kiev authorities. And you know, it's terrible, it's awful, but I mean, it's also what's happening. And so if you are a displaced Ukrainian, whoever like went online and critiqued Putin or knows anybody that did not agree with the invasion and resisted, that could be a problem for you. And your returning home is probably not likely. That's if your home has not already been sold to settlers from out in Russia's east or elsewhere already. Because that has already happened. And there are a lot of like real estate agents going through occupied territory, taking abandoned homes from people who are now living in Germany or in Canada or wherever, and they're selling them off. And so I think that this is already going to be extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to stomach, the giving up of any territory. And the idea that Trump wouldn't be able to negotiate any of that land back, whether it be Mariupol, like for example, Crimea and the Donbass. What about the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson then? What about the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson? Because if you're freezing the current front line or making them give up the rest of the Donbass, you have to get something out of the Russians, or all Trump is doing is going up there and he's conceding. He's making America look weak. He's making the Ukrainians look weak. He's making Europe's defense look weak. He's giving Putin a massive victory, and he's encouraging the behavior. And if on top of all of these land captures, and if on top of squashing Ukraine's leverage, going past that to say no NATO membership for at least 20 years, what does that do for deterrence? Oh, we'll pump them full of weapons? How long will that last? If Trump's main argument on the campaign trail was, I don't want to keep sending weapons to this forever war is bad, I'm sick of forever war, but I would like to also make a deal where I'm pumping Ukraine full of weapons for the next 20 years. For me, I feel like it would be a very unstable foundation, where maybe Ukraine would get weapons for a year, then 2 years, and then Trump would come back saying, I like this natural resource, gimme, and we'll give you another year's worth of weapons. oh, I like all this wheat, I like all this coal, I like all these mineral resources. If you want to continue to give up this, then we're going to have this quid pro quo relationship with Ukraine's natural wealth. All right, I'm fearful of that from Trump, just because of the way he's engaged in politics before. How he talked about taking the oil from Syria as compensation. Compensation for what? Who knows? But compensation for something. Compensation for something, that is for sure. Because it's hard for me to see him making his main argument, we need to stop the war so we don't have to spend American money on it anymore. And then his solution is we're just going to spend money on it for 20 years. It's just, I'm not saying that it's impossible that Trump implements a policy that contradicts his previous rhetoric. I mean, come on. But what I am saying is that guaranteeing him to implement a policy that contradicts his previous rhetoric, the rhetoric that his audience has gotten accustomed to, that I am not so sure of. Because if you get into Republican base, and this is largely due to Trump, which is another reason I'm very concerned about a Trump presidency, it has been really polarized against Ukraine aid and against Ukraine's struggle, just period, where you'll see some pretty crazy propaganda out there against Ukraine. Number one, we'll see people who were always talking about, like, if we ever get invaded, I will fight to the last breath. Like telling Ukrainians they need to roll over because it's weak and helpless compared to mighty Russia. And it's just like this weakness in the face of adversity that I don't know if they would ever reflect if it was domestic here. But because it's the nice, fun, contrarian position online today, and it's the ones touted by their favorite podcast, they're willing to accept that for another country, even though they'd never accept those standards for their own. But putting aside that, there's also just all these like rumors and lies. I already understand like the basic like American isolationism that has been here for a while. But this idea of like, for example, sitting congressmen going on TV and talking about the harvesting of Ukrainian children's organs in order to fund the war effort. Just complete lies and nonsense. Vivek Ramaswamy saying that American weapons sent to Ukraine were being redirected to cartels that then went and killed Americans. He went and he deleted and wiped the internet's traces of this on the internet after he got called out about it for enough times. And that's another man that has wiggled his way into Trump world. I mean, the entire campaign, all of Vivek's campaign was wiggling himself in the Trump world, but he's successfully done so. And this type of propaganda isn't, I think, just having an impact on the base. I do think it's having an impact on some leadership. I've seen like Congressman Luna, Senator Ron Johnson, and others repeating a lot of this bogus nonsense on alt media platforms, on social media, and sometimes even during mainstream TV interviews. I remember it was on CNN, Representative Luna was asked, like, Representative Luna said Ukraine had the opportunity to join NATO and they didn't, and so now this is their fault. And when the reporter was like, what are you talking about? Ukraine wanted to join and we didn't let them. They said, I politely disagree. They've chosen to live in their own separate reality. And this is all in this disinformation environment, which is, I think, it's largely motivated by profiteering. I think it's motivated by people who are, I think a lot of them lying propagandists, both for domestic reasons and foreign policy reasons, like either lying because they want to, take the country into a more isolationist direction, or lying because, they're being paid off by propagandists. But I mean, like the propagandist angle, I don't want to get into all the personal motivations for why people are going out and pushing disinfo. But like here's one example of disinfo you're seeing. And this is, people could say this is having a tiny impact, but I've engaged people who believe this type of nonsense. I've seen it at Trump rallies, and it has an impact. This has 11.9 million views. This is from an account that's blocked me, by the way. From the Orthodox Canonist. Ukrainian soldiers dress up mannequin in a Trump 2024 t-shirt and MAGA hat. They then begin firing at it and set it ablaze. It's time to defund this degenerate country. You guys, like the people who talk about like the false flags, the people who talk about the false flags the most, the people who talk about the conservative, like conservatives, like getting tricked on this deep state theory or that deep state theory, like They're you know, all this deep state now. They're the people that are so easily manipulatable when it comes to this propaganda. This is the most obvious fake nonsense I've seen related to the war. When I say that, I mean, okay, let's just point out a few things. Number one, it's very beautiful and very convenient that these Ukrainian soldiers decided when filming this that they were going to open straight up with their insignia being the biggest thing the camera can see. They're going to open with their insignia right in frame. It's really the only thing you can see on them. Isn't some like big boobs or some crazy like offensive patch that says I got drafted by some crappy. And when you meet soldiers, that's what they're mostly covered in. No, it's the insignia to identify them as Ukrainian soldiers. Okay, that's weird. Now, you know, it's also weird. There's nothing indicating what unit they're from. There's nothing indicating from what military formation they're from. You can't see their faces. You can't clearly hear their voices to identify if they're actually serving in the armed forces and trying to find some record to see that they're real and they're there. But also, this guy who is firing in frame, the main guy in front of us, is firing a rifle with no sight. Because for some reason, this guy has decided that he's the best shot in the entire Wild West. And while fighting the largest land war in Europe since World War II, you don't need silly nonsense like aim. Who needs aim? I mean, all he's doing is fighting mannequins out in the... Look, this is nonsense. This is nonsense. If you cannot identify what unit they're with, if you cannot see their face, if you cannot hear their voice, if the only thing that they're doing is showing you like, I am Ukrainian, if the gun doesn't match... and you got no other information that can geolocate them within Ukrainian-controlled territory, it's just a field in the middle of nowhere, this is propaganda. You're getting manipulated. This is Russian propaganda. This is 100% produced by the FSB. I don't need to know anything else about this to say this is produced by the FSB. If you're falling for it, you're a schmuck, you're a dumb schmuck, and the age of AI is going to molest your eyeballs into you living in fantasy cuckoo la la land, okay? And I wish you nothing but good luck, because you should have Facebook and Twitter locked off your phone for your own information hygiene. And it's not just this account that was pushing this, by the way. Here's Clown World, another very popular right-wing account pushing it, to another 187,000 people getting their interactions from the replies. Wow, we paid for that ammo. The most corrupt government on earth accusing Trump of corruption is fake irony, right? Look, it's fake. I'm not the only person who can see this is clearly fake. It's clearly fake. But this type of propaganda has an impact. And when you pair this propaganda, bred for the purpose of turning Americans against Ukraine aid, because for some reason these Ukrainian soldiers took time out of their day to fire at this random map. By the way, if it was something that would be angry, they'd be shooting at like a portrait of Trump. They would not be targeting Trump supporters. It doesn't even make any sense. What would they know about Trump supporters? Well, they would be putting up, and this is how I've seen it, right? I've seen them get like shooting ranges of politicians they don't like, put it down range and fire at it. But you want to know, it's like Sergei Lavrov. It's like Russian politicians they don't like. It would be much more believable if it was one of Trump. But instead, they focus on the supporter. Almost as if it's not meant for Trump. It's not meant to, express displeasure at American policy. It's meant to make it seem like the Ukrainians hate you. The Ukrainians hate you. You right there who voted for Trump, they hate you. You're scum. You're horrible. They hate you. They think they're just like with the woke mob. And then it turns you against Ukraine because, it's creating an us versus them mentality. And then you stack on top of that Trump going out there and saying, 3 million, 4 million, whoever million amount of people died, making up death numbers. We've sent over $300 billion to Ukraine, double what we've actually sent. The Europeans aren't sending anything. The Europeans are sending double what we've sent. It's kind of funny how that works. Or any of the other lies he's told about the war, or any of the other nonsense he said about the war. And then he calls Zelensky the greatest salesman on earth. He's fostering an environment within the Republican Party that is, generally speaking, isolationist, unless we're talking about Israel. I'm not saying it's a consistent foreign policy. I'm just saying it's a generally isolationist foreign policy. And Ukraine is the them when we're the us. They're the ones that are coming to us like a welfare queen asking for our support and this is all devoid of any historical context, Budapest Memorandum, but under that framing, it's very easy for Trump to use his base to further turn them against Ukraine aid. But also, and this is the thing that really scares me, let's say Trump changes his mind. Let's say he appoints Mike Pompeo, and then we get Senator Majority Leader Thune, and they're more, in supportive of Ukraine, and they think that if we cave to some, let's say, pretty a Russian demand made of hubris that pushes Trump against, making a deal in the moment. I mean, Trump's not somebody who's never gone back on his word. Remember the TikTok ban? Then he meets with the TikTok lobbyists, and never mind, he's against the TikTok ban now. It's not like he's not somebody to go back on his word, but when he's so vocal and so loud about ending the war in 24 hours, about ending it before anybody can really do anything to stop it, just going in there and boom, he's brought peace. It's kind of hard to just completely 180 on it, even if the Russians make a crazy bad demand. And I'm not saying that he won't. I'm just saying it would be depriving him of an early PR victory to the base that delivered him this victory by turning out. And when Harris lost, it's because her base didn't turn out. Trump's base did turn out. Who does he want to reward? That concerns me, because as a deal maker, and this is something Trump should know, as somebody who wrote Art of the Deal, not necessarily saying he does know this, but saying he should know it, you need to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away. And if the Russians don't offer a good deal, they need to be able to say, look, this is just going to kick the can down the road. I mean, solidifying control of current territory, and America just gives them weapons. What if the Russians invade in 5 years, or they just wait until our weapons are preoccupied with the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and then they invade Ukraine again, trying to conquer the rest of it, or taking more territory, or making sure the Ukrainians can never try to take back the land that is currently occupied? These are scenarios that the Trump government's going to have to play out if they don't just want to look like they got rolled at the end of the day. Whether or not they do that is completely up in the air. Completely up in the air. Now, Zelensky says that the phone call that they had with Elon and Trump, he was not super surprised, but he didn't go away from it feeling discouraged, because Trump gave him the general message of we're not going to abandon you, but with no specifics on what that would mean when it comes to non-abandonment. Just the general kind of like pat on the back, like, we're with you, buddy. That could mean anything with Trump. Trump is somebody who's pulled the rug out of from under quite a few people, but it didn't leave Zelensky panicking, which, I mean, is good, but I would have already been slightly panicking once I saw that Elon was in the room to begin with. So maybe he is just a stronger man than I. Could just quite be. Dylan, I have a question. In the next 2 months, what can Biden do? This is a good question. And I think this is the right question. Because right now we're waiting for Trump's appointments. Right now we're seeing what path Trump gets dug in on. We're seeing what kind of a pitch Zelensky can make. And I made a tweet today to try to give you an idea of the way I think Zelensky should approach this a little bit. This is my draft tweet of what we should be throwing at Trump. Hello at real Donald Trump. Obama let the Russians invade Crimea. Very weak. You stopped blocking aid to Ukraine, even without information on Hunter. Very generous. Biden doesn't let Ukraine hit big Russian air bases. Very woke. We need strong president. You be strong president? Caw, American Eagle. Look, Zelensky has to be suave. He has to be smooth. He has to go in there and make it seem to Trump that it's more beneficial for him to continue to support Ukraine or negotiate from a position of strength behind him, in line with Trump's stated philosophy of peace through strength. He needs to go in there and make it seem like it's personally beneficial for him, not only politically to be victorious in this way, but also for the country and him. We know how Trump is with the oil in Syria. Whether Zelensky's going to go in there, as I hear, maybe make some deal like, hey, you want access to Ukraine's natural resources? I don't know. But Zelensky is going to have to find a way to make that personal type of you help me, I helped you relationship possibly have to work. Now, I don't think Ukraine Ukrainian politics is not full of examples of them trying to do that and succeeding domestically. I think that might be part of the problem with Ukrainian politics, but they might have to export that internationally now. Good luck. Good luck. Now, so Zelensky's performance, it needs to be top tier. But as for what Biden can do, so the first major thing Biden needed to do, he already did. And that is announcing that every single bit of available Ukraine aid needs to go, and it needs to go right now. And that was $6 billion that had yet to be allocated to future aid shipments. The Biden administration, the first thing they did on Ukraine policy, once finding out Trump was going to be future president of the United States, is to approve $6 billion in aid. So they're taking everything that's been approved in the previous aid deal, and they're trying to send it over to Ukraine before the year is done. Now, the Pentagon spokesperson, which you can see on screen right here, this is Sabrina Singh. She says that they're confident that they can get the $6 billion there in time. The problem, though, is that they can only give Ukraine the $6 billion through stocks of stuff the United States has already given Ukraine and has in its stockpiles. For example, they could send them over 155 millimeter shells that they currently have in U.S. stocks because they've sent Ukraine that before and they have it in U.S. stocks. But if we're talking about aid that has not yet been built, for example, if they only have 100,000 to give, but they want to get 250,000 over to Ukraine, but it's not going to be produced before January 20th, then those shells cannot be included in the $60 billion before they get there. And there's an impetus to get it out quickly, because if Donald Trump gets in and there's $3 billion of aid that is yet to be sent over, Donald Trump could just stop sending the aid and then use that extra $3 billion that was already congressionally approved to be sent to Ukraine as leverage against the Ukrainians, saying, well, maybe I'll let this aid come to you right now if you give me this in negotiations. So it's trying to get as much over the line before Trump could potentially turn off the spigot. So I'm hoping that they can accomplish that. The Pentagon spokesperson says they're confident they can. But there's also been a lot of deliveries that have been promised and have been said that we're going to get them to this day, and then they don't arrive that day. And then there's whole mechanized brigades that are without the equipment they need to go out there and operate. And so they're just turned into kind of rifle brigades. And then, they're not as protected and they have to drive around in buggies and pickup trucks. And it's not good stuff. So we'll see. But this is the first decision that had to be made, and it was made. Another decision that was made was about U.S. contractors. U.S. contractors can operate in Ukraine now. And the main way they're probably going to be operating in Ukraine, and when I say contractors, I mean military contractors. Now, some people might get images in their head of like Solid Snake now being sent to Ukraine to assassinate like the head of some battalion. No. What's likely what the Ukrainians need most desperately is people to work on the air defense systems that we provide them and the American equipment that they don't have the engineers that have been working on them. Now, that's not saying that Ukrainian engineers can't figure it out, but if you've been working on Soviet gear for 20, 30 years, and now you have to work on this M113 or this A1 Abrams, that's a big shift. And having some American engineers over there to not only help work on it, but help train your domestic engineers on how to maintain it into the future, especially if this is the gear that they're going to be receiving going into the future, that's pretty important. I'm not saying that, these contractors serving in an official military capacity of frontline combat isn't impossible, especially since the Ukrainians need manpower and they need it yesterday. But I'm just saying that that's probably what it's going to be concentrated on. As for the other things that Biden can do, I know the Kyiv Independent wrote up this article that Biden has 6 weeks left. Here's what he could do. I think right now, in my opinion, and we'll go through this article quickly just to see like the big bullet points of what they're saying that they could do. Here's my argument for why Biden should go balls to the walls in the next few months that he has. My essential argument is this. The threat of escalation has largely vanished, I think, for the next 2 months. I'm not saying that if Biden launches a nuke towards the Russians, they won't do anything. But when it comes to the areas that were being considered as possible escalation nodes, I think that they have been numbed going into the next presidency. The Russians are now preparing for Trump to enter the White House. The Russians have already had 7 phone calls with Donald Trump. before he was president of the United States. Whatever they discussed, I don't know. Elon Musk, who is now close to the president, also had similar phone calls, not only Trump, with not only Putin, but has also had conversations with some of Putin's lackeys, including those who are running disinformation operations outside of the Russian Federation. True story, go look it up. Now, if they're having all these conversations, I think it's likely that some of it has to do with the war in Ukraine. I think it's also likely, and we've already seen some overtures from Putin publicly, that there might be some phone calls between Putin and Trump now in a semi-official capacity since he's now president-elect. And I think in that same time, as, you know, they're talking it out and trying to figure out how to approach diplomacy with the Russians come January 20th, what Biden does for the next 2 months isn't going to matter all that much in the Russian mindset post J20th. Because if it is true that they can have some discussion with Trump, now maybe that goes awry and it doesn't matter, but if it's true that they can at least try to work him, that attempt is too valuable for them to abandon it because of what Biden does in the next 2 months, in my mind. The idea of Biden just approved long-range strikes, so we're not going to try to end this on favorable terms come January 20th. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. If anything, I would even say if you're a Trumpel, you would want Biden to go balls to the wall so he could put Trump in the best negotiating position possible. Like, man, I have all these new permissions. Imagine Trump, from the Russian perspective, with permission now given for the Ukrainians to fire American missiles deep into Russia. Now, and I will say on one hand, that's scary because if I was the Russians, a situation that I was hoping for could quickly become a situation I am dreading. The idea of you pissing off Trump in negotiations, and now he's going to be like, how can I get back at Putin? Oh, I know, 200 ATACMS over to the Ukrainians. Lickity's quick. Just get it over there quick. Let's piss them off. That is a possibility. I think it's still an unlikely possibility, but it is a possibility. So I would say, now I would say that also comes with its own risks, but I mean, now we're playing high stakes poker. Okay, we're playing high stakes poker. So I think since we have this window where the Russians are going to try to get some favorable deal come January 20th, or they're at least working towards that end, Biden should see it as he has more leverage in avoiding escalation in the next few months than at any other point in his presidency, which leads me to think now would be the time to approve things like long-range strikes to hit the ammunition depots, the barracks, and the few air bases that are still operating within a range of possible ATACMS strikes. He took too long, could have been much more devastating if it was earlier on, but better late than never, I suppose, is the idea. That would be one decision he could do. Another decision he could make is to go harder on sanctions. Trump is somebody who's talked about using sanctions quite openly and tariffs, but he also said he wanted to remove sanctions on the Russians. So cranking up the pressure to put Trump again, and even if he doesn't want it, an even better negotiating position, a stronger one on sanctions, I think is something that President Biden could do. And there's some other stuff as well, but I think let's go through the Kiev Independent article quickly. Just go through their bullet points. Number 1, seizing Russian assets. Take the money and do it now. Aaron Gash-Burnett, a fellow and project manager of Berlin's Democratic Strategy Initiative, told the Kiev Independent. The money Burnett is referring to is the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets that has been sitting mostly in European banks for the majority of the war. Only in October of this year did the group of 7 countries finally agree on a deal that would allow for the interest they've accumulated to be given to Ukraine in the form of a $50 billion loan to Kiev, which it is yet to receive. What Biden could do is simply seize the U.S.-based frozen assets themselves and give them to Ukraine so it can finance the war itself. There are $5 billion of Russian state assets frozen in the United States. The American government's been much more open to this idea. It is held back in large part because of objections from its European allies. But I think part of the reason why is the vast majority of these assets are held in Brussels. They're held in Belgian financial institutions connected to Euroclear. We only have $5 billion to us compared to the $300 billion overall. But if Biden is trying to get the $6 billion over to Ukraine as quickly as he can because of the impact it could have, an extra $5 billion quickly funneled over could also have quite an impact, especially, again, we're trying to buy Ukraine breathing room for the potential first difficult months of a Trump presidency, where I don't know if his first priority is going to be introducing legislation into the House to quickly pass more Ukraine aid. Biden could do this tomorrow if he wanted to, saying that the U.S. Repo Act gives him that power. If he wanted to, he could just move ahead and declare that these assets are getting seized, or at the very least, the assets that are dominated in American money, an estimated $16 billion, possibly even more. Some European countries, including France and Germany, have resisted such a move, which Burnett said is due to fear of retaliation and reprisals from Moscow, with the G7 agreement on loans backed by an interest a way to placate all sides. It's basically a magic trick to turn $300 billion into $50 billion because you're too scared to make the necessary choices. He adds that with an incoming Trump administration, Biden would have a strong argument to get reluctant European nations on board. If Trump cuts aid to Ukraine, the financial burden is going to fall on them. That is true. And releasing a big lump sum now would be better than having interest build up over time. Unsurprisingly, it's a step that Ukraine is also calling for. Military aid. The same is true of U.S. military aid. On November 7th, the Pentagon said it was committing to sending Ukraine the outstanding $6 billion. Ukraine will receive $4 billion under the PDA, which pools weapons from U.S. stocks, and $2 billion from the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. When asked if the U.S. had enough weapons stockpiled to get shipments to Ukraine, Sting, the Pentagon spokesperson, said she was confident. So we're actually constantly backfilling and restocking our shelves. Okay, we already agree with the Kiev Independent on this. Long-range strikes, we already discussed this. NATO membership. While immediate NATO membership isn't currently on the table with the war ongoing, there are some steps Biden could take to bring it closer to reality. And I have heard rumors that that they are considering some symbolic move on NATO membership, whatever that means. Kiev submitted its application to join in September of 2022, and in July of 2024, the alliance affirmed Ukraine's irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration. But Ukraine has yet to receive a time frame regarding when this will happen. A report in the Financial Times last month said Biden may agree to advance the status of Ukraine's NATO membership before leaving office in January. While Volker didn't specify what the gesture and the direction of Ukraine's NATO membership could be, he cautioned against being too optimistic. On NATO membership, we have to be very, very careful. You don't want to put that out prematurely. You don't want it to be uncoordinated with allies. Okay. Where do we go from here? So, in my mind, Biden needs to make the decisions that Trump cannot make back when it comes to decisions on long-range strikes, and leverage that might not even necessarily be particularly wanted. Trump did a lot of work to undercut his own leverage before entering office. For example, in delaying the aid to Ukraine that he at any point could have told his lackeys in Congress, pass it, we need to get it in there so that when I'm in office, the Russians are in a worse position so we can get the best deal. But he didn't. There was certainly no calling from the base because he's antagonized his position. He used Ukraine as a campaign punching bag, and now that is being reflected in the sentiments of the general population, and we're living with the impacts of that. So that's difficult. But Biden, by making these decisions, can force leverage onto Trump that him and his team could not help but have to recognize the significance of. And if they have that leverage and we lean into any part of their philosophy of peace through strength, that could mean them aiming for a better deal or trying to get more out of the Russians than they maybe couldn't have otherwise. Especially if Trump is making all these signals towards peace and such, he gets in office and immediately approves long-range strikes. That might not be the immediate diplomatic overture he wants to make. And it's probably not going to be the one that Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, David Sachs, Tucker Carlson, or any of these types are going to be whispering in his ear. Maybe it'd be what Mike Pompeo would whisper in his ear. Maybe Senate Leader Corn or Thune. But I do not think that would be likely for the U.S. ambassador to Germany or for any of these other previous characters. And so a lot of this is going to be up to a coin flip. But if it's up to a coin flip, Biden still needs to do the best he can to increase the odds of that coin flip. And with more cover given by this prospective Trump presidency, which the Russians are probably going to make a full court press on diplomatic efforts, there's no good excuse, I think, anymore for Biden to hold back in these last few months. If they failed to stop Trump from becoming president and securing the stability of the future of the Euro-Atlantic relationship, Biden has to do the best to set the sail, to set the ship, to set the pathway forward for the Ukrainians to the best of his ability. And that will mean crossing some lines he previously wasn't able to cross. Well, no, wasn't able isn't saying it correctly. Wasn't willing to cross. He needs to be able to cross it now, especially if he means to give Trump any significant leverage compared to the leverage he has now going into negotiations. And if negotiations fail, then better to set the Ukrainians up for the best struggle they can to survive, or at least the best odds of survival in any entailing struggle, which I still think is very likely. There's still the outcome. And why I say very likely, I don't know how to give a specific percentage for it, but I do think that there is a likely enough outcome, whether it be 20 or 30%, that what happens is Trump sits down, willing to negotiate with the Russians, willing to give them a good deal. And what happens is the Russians, unwilling to accept that deal once more, because they worked hard to get Trump elected, or they don't think it's enough for the amount they've bled for. And instead of accepting, frozen lines, they're like, okay, we want frozen lines, but also Kursk back for nothing in exchange. And the Ukraine, well, you at least have to give them back what you guys hold in Kharkiv. Well, no, we're not willing to do that. Or, well, okay, you at least have to accept they're going to send them weapons. No, you cannot send them weapons into the future. Or whatever hubris it is, leads to Donald Trump actually going harder, sending more aid instead of retracting on less aid. And this seems to be the holdout that many Ukrainians are hoping for. That either Trump, through showing this peace through strength, will be able to get the best deal out of the Russians, which I am skeptical of, or we're going to get U.S. aid on hyperdrive instead of a slow bleeding out under a Biden-Harris administration, which I'm also highly skeptical of. And I think the first big indicator of what pathway they're going to take is who's going to be National Security Advisor, who's going to be Secretary of State, where Mike Pompeo's going, where the U.S. Ambassador to Germany's going, and who's going to be the one whispering in Trump's ear, which tends to shift him mightily in foreign policy decisions.